Well, good morning. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. As Denise said, I'm the Vice President of Regulatory and Technical Affairs with the National Fisheries Institute. If you're not familiar with NFI, we're a trade organization. We represent seafood processors, importers, restaurants, retail in the United States. A couple industries we do not represent because of differences of views on trade, and those are the domestic shrimp industry and the domestic catfish industry. But other than that, we say we represent the entire seafood industry. Before I joined NFI, I've been with NFI for 9 years now. I was with another food association for 18 years, so I guess my career has pretty much been based in the trade association world in Washington, D.C. So today I want to focus on some regulations that we are facing today. And those have to do with the Food Safety Modernization Act. As John mentioned, acronyms are used quite a bit in the government and in Washington. How many people here have heard of FSMA? Oh, good. So, yeah, that makes it easier to start out. So FSMA, or the Food Safety Modernization Act, was a law that was passed in 2011. And I suggested this topic because there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding about what FSMA is or what it isn't and how it impacts the seafood industry. So I hopefully during this presentation will provide some clarity there for you folks that are dealing with the seafood industry, because I'm sure you receive a lot of questions about what FSMA is and how it impacts us. So just briefly what it is. It was a law that was passed in 2011. It amended the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So if you were to look in the code of laws in the United States, what was implemented with FSMA is in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The act made changes to the law that really regulates our food production in the United States, other than meat and poultry. This was the biggest change in food safety laws in the more than 70 years. And it really shifted the focus of FDA's inspections and regulations from response to outbreaks or recalls to really require prevention of the industry. And for those of you that deal with seafood processors, you're like, well, this sounds really familiar, because seafood has been under a mandatory preventive type regulation for almost 20 years now. The Seafood HACCP regulation under FDA. So FSMA, what it really is, it's a law. It requires FDA to do many things. Some of the things that were required were immediate, self-implementing type actions. Some of the mandates of FSMA required regulations. I'm not going to talk about the list that's here on this slide, but there were some immediate actions that the entire food industry saw coming out of FSMA. FSMA gave FDA mandatory recall authority. People don't really realize that in the past, FDA could not make someone recall a product if there was an issue with it. They can make your life very difficult if you chose not to recall, but they had no way of making you do a recall. Now FDA can take action if a company refuses to recall product. FSMA also authorized a biannual facility registration renewal process. So actually we're in the third round of that. Every even number year from October to December, food facilities in the U.S. and then in foreign countries that export product to the United States have to register with FDA. So they have to renew their registration every 2 years. So first round was in 2012, 2014. Now we're in the third round of that. FSMA also gave FDA enhanced records access. If they feel that there's something wrong, there's a health hazard with a food, they can demand to see records associated with the production of that food. FDA also has the authority now to suspend a facility registration, which means that company can't ship any product out of that firm. And this was an easier way to have the agency address food safety issues in the facility. In the past, they actually had to have a court order to have an injunction against a firm to prevent them from shipping product. Now they can pull your registration and the company can't ship product. And they just recently did that with a seafood salad company for listeria contamination. So rather than having a court order, they just cancel their registration. That company can't ship product. Another immediate action, which they haven't implemented yet, for imported product that's deemed high risk, highly likely to cause illness or injury, they can require certification from the foreign government before that product can be entered into the United States. They haven't implemented that authority yet. If you read FSMA, the law, you'll see that there were 2 key exemptions in that law that benefit the seafood industry. There's one, and we'll talk about these later on in the presentation, but one section of FSMA, hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. Seafood processors who are in compliance with the seafood HACCP regulation are exempted from that piece of the law. And also foreign supplier verification program. Seafood processors that are in compliance with the regulation are exempted from those programs. So I think this caused a lot of confusion in the industry where the seafood processors saw, I'm exempt. So you heard a lot of misstatements about what the seafood industry was exempted from. Seafood industry is not exempted from the entire FSMA. There's plenty of things in there that seafood processors have to do, like mandatory recall or give records over to FDA if they ask. But these 2 key exemptions, I think, are causing a lot of confusion. So hopefully we'll clarify that. I mentioned that FSMA required FDA to develop some regulations. There are 7 key regulations that they have come out with. They're all final now in various stages of implementation. Not all these apply to seafood, obviously. But the 7 rules, if you're not familiar with it, what they are, there's a preventive controls for human foods rule, preventive controls for animal food and feed, foreign supplier verification program. There's a rule that talks about accreditation of third-party auditors, produce safety, sanitary transportation of foods, and prevention of intentional adulteration. So it's been a very busy time at FDA and in the trade association world. I crossed out 3 rules that have absolutely no impact on seafood processors. Seafood industry is exempt completely from the foreign supplier verification program. The accreditation of third-party auditors is really a regulation for accreditation bodies and auditors. There would be an impact to a seafood processor if they were to hire a third-party auditor for some reason. But the regulation itself only speaks to the auditors and the auditing bodies. And then obviously produce safety has no impact on seafood. So just to go through these regulations, and I know a lot of people in the room are scientists, you're not really into talking about regulations. I think I'm more of a regulation type person, so I could talk for quite a bit about regulations, so we'll try not to get too overboard here. But the first regulation that I think people hear the most about is the regulation Current Good Manufacturing Practice and Hazard Analysis and Risk-Based Preventive Controls for Human Food. Quite a mouthful here. It was published last year, finalized last year. On each slide I have the citation of where you would find it in the regulations. This has been implemented for the large companies now. Implementation date was September 19th, 2016. There's staggered implementation based on the size of the company. Small companies are those that have fewer than 500 employees. So they're given another year to 2017. And then the very small companies are those that have less than $1 million of annual sales. They're given to 2018 to implement this regulation. Now, if you remember earlier, I mentioned that seafood was exempt from a preventive controls regulation. And that is true. Seafood is exempted from the majority of the requirements in that regulation. That regulation has 7 subparts, A through G, I think if I counted right. Seafood processors only have to pay attention to subparts A, B, and parts of F. And the reason is that FDA chose to take this opportunity to update the current good manufacturing practice regulation when they finalized the preventive controls regulation as mandated by FSMA. So the modifications to the CGMPs was not part of FSMA, but it was tacked on to this effort because it made sense to the agency to include these updates. They've been talking about these for years, even before FSMA came about. So subpart B, seafood is not exempted from that subpart. It modernizes the current good manufacturing practice regulations, the old 21 CFR Part 110, or CGMPs, however you want to refer to it. It modernizes those. It renumbers it, which I think causes some confusion. So it's now found in 117, subpart B. So seafood processors have to pay attention to that piece. And if you're a plant with over 500 employees, you need to be following that now because the implementation date was September 2016. But the main focus of this major regulation is requirements for hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. And this applies to all foods that FDA regulates except seafood, juice, because juice has a HACCP regulation, some aspects of low acid canned food, and I believe infant formula. So the key takeaways from this regulation are really for seafood processors, and if you're a consultant helping the seafood industry, the key takeaways are the modified GMPs. They weren't changed significantly. Probably the major change was FDA emphasized their previous expectations for the industry to prevent the cross-contact of allergen proteins during production. They've always had that expectation. It wasn't spelled out in the regulation. Though it's pretty explicitly spelled out that your good manufacturing practices need to be conducted in a way to prevent allergen cross-contact. There's a training requirement that applies to seafood processors as well. This training requirement is in subpart A. That applies to seafood as well. And that establishes a training requirement for all employees that are helping to produce the food in your facility. And the basic training requirement is that whoever's manufacturing, processing, packing, holding the food has to be qualified somehow. They need to know what they're doing. You just can't pull someone off the street and throw them on a processing line and expect that they know what they're doing and they're going to do it correctly. So there has to be some training component so everyone is qualified to do their job. And they also have to receive some type of training that explains the importance of food hygiene, personal hygiene, food safety, and how it's important for their job. And that level of training really depends on what the person is doing. If they're driving a forklift, they need a lesser degree of training on the importance of hand washing versus someone who's on the line producing a ready-to-eat food. And there's a record-keeping requirement that documents this training. FDA doesn't expect everyone to be going to a 3-day HACCP course, but there has to be some level of training and awareness of all the employees in the facility. So this is a new requirement for the industry. Some areas where there's some concern is some of the terminology that's used. Qualified individuals is now defined in the regulation, and that refers to this level of training where people are qualified to do what they've been assigned to do in their job. There's also terminology in the regulation, preventive controls qualified individual. That person does not need to be employed by a seafood company because they're doing tasks from this regulation that do not apply to the seafood industry. So we hear from our members, they've gone through this PC training, and it's like, well, you don't need to. You're not need to follow that part of the regulation. So I think there's some confusion there where people are trying to sell courses, get more people to sign up for courses, targeting the seafood industry where those courses might not apply to them. So that's the human food side. FSMA also required FDA to have regulations for animal food. That includes pet food, animal feed, ingredients that go into animal food or feed. This has been a big change for that industry because that industry had no current good manufacturing practice regulations in the past. They had no food safety regulations. So they're given a little more time to comply with the regulations. They're given 1 year for current good manufacturing practices and an additional year for the hazard analysis and preventive controls part of the regulation. The staggered phase-in period, again, is based on size. The largest companies are those that have more than 500 employees. And the very small, the last one here, are companies that have less than $2.5 million of annual sales. And then the threshold for the small company, threshold for the small companies is the 500 employees. This regulation really parallels the human food side. So I know the animal feed industry was kind of concerned because it was so closely aligned with what's involved with human foods. This regulation applies to the production of any food that an animal is going to eat or an ingredient. It includes seafood-based animal foods or animal feed, fish meal, fish oil that's going into animal feed falls under this regulation. There are no exemptions for seafood processors in this regulation. So again, there's requirements that companies have to have good manufacturing practices in place, and they have to do a hazard analysis and develop a risk-based preventive control. So again, the key takeaway, seafood is not exempt. It applies, there's portions of this regulation that apply to human food facilities that make animal food. Maybe you have one line that does human food, another line that does pet food, or you have a fish meal plant in your facility, or if you donate or sell byproduct from the production of animal or human food, you sell that byproduct to go into making fish meal or go into pet food. The regulations apply to your operation. Now, if you're only diverting the byproduct, so you're collecting the waste and you're sending it to a fish meal plant or to a renderer, there's very few parts of the regulation that apply to you. You can follow your human food GMPs. The key piece is that when you're holding that byproduct before you ship it, that you have to prevent physical and chemical contamination of that byproduct. So you're not throwing trash in the same bin that you're throwing your waste product. So you have to take steps to make sure you're not contaminating that waste while you're holding it. If you were to further process it, if you were to dry it, produce fish meal, then the whole regulation kicks in for you. You are allowed to freeze it to kind of stabilize it before you ship it. That's not considered processing. But any type of heat treatment would be considered processing, and the entire regulation would kick in. There's some labeling requirements for the waste that you're diverting from your human food facility. You need to label that product while you're holding it so people know what it is. Again, so you're not confusing it with a trash bin. And you have to label it that identifies the byproduct when you're shipping it to wherever it's going. And then there's shipping requirements as well. The shipping containers need to be clean so you're not contaminating that byproduct. And the facility itself has to give instructions to the entity that's transporting that human food byproduct, so it's transported in a proper way. So those are the key takeaways from that. We don't, as an association, we don't focus too much on this regulation. Not a lot of our members are actually producing an ingredient for animal food or animal feed. Really the main thing is that people are aware that this regulation could impact their business, especially if they're doing fish meal in their operation. The fourth regulation I want to talk about is the sanitary transportation of human and animal food. And down here is the citation for it. It's 1.900 to 1.934 in the regulations. This applies to both human and animal food. This really isn't a regulation that was authorized by FSMA. This was authorized by a law that was passed in 2005, the Sanitary Food Transportation Act. The history of that act is quite long. It originally went to the Department of Transportation, and they decided they didn't know how to implement a regulation for it. It was passed to FDA. FDA kind of dragged their feet. So in the FSMA language, Congress pretty much told FDA, you need to come up with a regulation for that act that we told you to do in 2005. So this really isn't a FSMA requirement. It was just put in FSMA that you got to do this. And they gave them a certain amount of time to do it. There's 2 implementation dates for this one. April of 2017 for large companies, those that have greater than 500 employees. 2018 for small companies that have fewer than 500 employees, and then for motor carriers that have less than $27.5 million of annual receipts. Companies that are smaller than that have less than $500,000 annual sales, are not covered by this regulation. So in a nutshell, there are requirements, new requirements for shippers, loaders, carriers, and receivers. So a shipper is the entity that arranges for food products to be shipped from one place to another. Loaders are the ones that actually put the food on the transportation truck or rail car. Carriers are the trucks or the rail cars. And then the receiver, obviously, is the entity that gets the product from that truck or rail car. There's requirements that talk about the condition of the vehicles and transportation equipment, and it all revolves around not contaminating the food product with a dirty truck or rail car. And then there's focuses on the transportation practices to ensure safe food. The whole focus is on food safety, not on quality. The proposal had some areas that talked about quality. They took that out. So the real focus is on proper refrigeration, if refrigeration is needed for food safety. So there are a lot of seafood products that's the case, that the vehicles are adequately cleaned, and then you're protecting the food from being contaminated during transportation. There's required training only for carrier personnel. So that's some confusion in that too, what kind of training is needed. It's only for the carrier personnel, the truck drivers, that they have to be trained to know what they need to be doing. There's some record keeping requirements, and we'll talk about that in the next couple slides. This law, the Sanitary Transportation Act, applies only to shipment by truck or rail. It doesn't include air transport. It also doesn't include carriers like delivery service like FedEx or UPS. And it only applies to transportation in the United States. So this is one area there's some confusion too, where you have a supplier in another country. They're thinking this law, the regulation applies to them, and that's not the case. The only foreign product that it would apply to is if you have a container on a ship, comes over to the United States, and that container is put intact on a truck. Then that's when it would kick in. So the shipper has the primary responsibility to determine what is needed for food safety to protect that food during distribution. So they are the ones to determine what temperature needs to be shipped at, how clean the truck needs to be. And they have to have controls and practices implemented to make sure that they're communicating that information to the loader and to the carrier. So they have to have written procedures, so that's one record that's required. And they have to notify the carrier in writing what the specifications are to the temperature controls or the sanitation or cleanliness of the trucks. So they have to specify in writing to the carrier what they need to be doing. So if the shipper says the product has to be shipped at 40 degrees or lower, they have to communicate that to the carrier. One-time notification is sufficient. You don't have to keep on repeating it if you're using the same carrier. So FDA really tried to limit the amount of records that were required. That was a big concern of the industry. Some foods are exempted if the food, from parts of the regulation, if the food is completely enclosed in a container, then there's no need to have a procedure for the cleanliness of the truck, because there's no way you're going to contaminate the food if it's completely enclosed. The temperature control requirements are those for safety, not for quality. So a lot of seafood products will fall into this category. The histamine formers, CBOT controls that we're looking at 38 degrees or lower, they will fall in this category, in this regulation. Loaders have requirements as well. They just have to make sure that they're following the specifications they received from the shipper. Receivers, the final person in the chain, has to determine that the food wasn't subjected to significant temperature abuse during transportation. The concern that we as an association have on this is that this rule doesn't supersede any seafood HACCP requirements. For those of you familiar with seafood HACCP, you know that the seafood HACCP regulation puts the onus of temperature abuse during shipping on the receiver. This regulation kind of puts the onus on the shipper, the front end, to tell the carrier what they need to be doing, and the receiver just has to make sure that there was no temperature abuse. So there might be some disconnect with seafood HACCP and this regulation. And I know as an industry we have some concern. There's, I think, a lot of unanswered questions with this regulation. There isn't any guidance out yet, and people are still kind of really thinking through what's going on and coming up with all kinds of doomsday scenarios with this. The carrier, who's the truck driver, the company with the trucks or the rail cars, they have to make sure they're meeting the shipper's specification. If asked, they have to demonstrate temperature was maintained during transportation. They have to have written procedures for cleaning their trucks, how they're maintaining temperature control, and then they have to train their personnel on food safety and sanitary issues and what they're responsible to do. One key takeaway from the regulation, the main one, is that at any point in transportation, if someone, a shipper, a loader, carrier, receiver, becomes aware of a failure in temperature control, they have to take action that the food must not be sold or distributed until someone, a qualified individual, which is different than the GMP qualified individual, makes a determination that the product is safe. One area, again, where there's some disconnect with HACCP is the regulation does say temperature deviations alone do not trigger essentially rejecting the product. There needs to be a determination made by the qualified individual. And the final regulation is what I call the food defense regulation. It's the focus mitigation strategies to protect food against intentional adulteration. Some of these regulations are quite a mouthful. And it's found in 21 CFR 121. Again, staggered implementation dates. Since this is a new concept for the food industry, for FDA to have a mandatory food defense regulation, the industry is given much longer time for implementation. The large companies have until 2019. The smaller ones, less than 500 full-time employees, to 2020. And then the very small companies, those with less than $10 million in annual sales, actually they have very few requirements. They're essentially exempted from this regulation, but they're given to 2021 to prove to FDA that they have fewer than $10 million of annual sales, which I thought was quite a bit of time to give someone to prove that they have fewer than $10 million of annual sales. But that's our regulation for you. In a nutshell, when I was reading the regulation, again, it's really, this is HACCP with a food defense slant. If you understand HACCP, you'll understand this regulation. The aim is to prevent the intentional adulteration from acts intended to cause wide-scale harm to the public. So really acts of terrorism, someone's tampering with the food supply. So you have to come up with ways of preventing that in your operation. It applies to all registered facilities, domestic and imported. The key takeaways here: facilities are required to conduct a written vulnerability assessment. So think of that as a hazard analysis, the substitute vulnerability assessment, where you're looking to see the potential health impact if a contaminant was added to the food, the severity, the scale of that, the degree of access a terrorist could have to your food supply, the ability of the attacker to be successful in contaminating your food supply. FDA does focus on 3 areas: bulk, liquid, loading, and receiving. So unless you're frying a fish product where you have bulk oil, that doesn't really apply if you're just harvesting fish and filleting fish. If you're storing liquid and handling liquid, that's one area that there's concern with contamination. But then if you have ingredient handling, you're mixing salt and sugar and sodium tripolyphosphate or whatever, you're mixing that, or other similar activities where you're mixing ingredients, that's another area that FDA considers vulnerable. So companies are required to do this vulnerability assessment, and then if they find they have vulnerabilities, and they have to have a written food defense plan. So think of that as a HACCP plan then. And that plan has to implement mitigation strategies. So think of it as control measures at CCPs. So here we have implement mitigation strategies to address vulnerabilities at actionable process steps, monitor, take corrective action, verify the system is working, train people, and maintain records. So it's really a HACCP approach to food defense. So there's a lot of regulations that are coming online. Some already are in place. So we advise our members to just kind of triage the implementation, see which ones apply to you. If you're not doing anything with animal food, then you can cross that one off your list. Obviously, if you're a large company with over 500 employees, the CGMPs for human foods is your first order of business, because that's already in effect. Sanitary transportation, you have until April next year. Intentional adulteration, 2019. So you have a little bit of time to think about what you need to do with that. And then obviously an extra year or 2 depending on your company size. So these regulations, there's some future fallout that we're seeing with these. There's just still the general confusion about the exemption for seafood. We see people going through training that they don't need to go through, or had a call from a member, they were asking for help on doing a food fraud vulnerability assessment. I'm like, well, where is that even coming from? There's no regulatory requirement for seafood for you to do that. So there's expectations from customers that might not align with the mandatory requirements for the seafood industry, expectations from third-party audits that might not align. There is an aspect of the human food preventive controls rule that deals with the supply chain. FDA has kind of pushed the implementation date or the compliance date for that piece further down the road. But there's some concerns that customers might request this information from the seafood industry, and that part of the regulation does not apply to the seafood industry. Environmental monitoring to address listeria contamination is not required by regulation for the seafood industry. I think many in FDA would require the seafood industry to do that. That is part of the PC rule. So we could see some changes down the road to bring the seafood industry in line with that. And finally, I didn't talk about the foreign supplier verification program at all, but FDA did state in the preamble to that regulation that down the road they are going to readdress the import requirements in the seafood HACCP regulation to bring the industry more aligned with the rest of the food industry. So that's it. See if there's any questions. Yes. Oh, Lori. Oh.
So while I have a lot of questions, the one question that I need answered, because we've been going back and forth about this with some of the HACCP models for the seafood. So transportation is normally not part of your seafood HACCP plan, except for shell stock. Apparently, I just learned that it was. So, she said, so in a HACCP plan, it doesn't have to be there, regardless of whether you have to comply with the transportation rule. You just have to take precautions to make sure that you have things in place to make sure that the transportation is appropriate for your receiver, correct? So it still does not have to appear in the HACCP plan for seafood operations.
That's
yes
correct.
Or no? Okay. So when you get to the receiving side, under seafood HACCP, they're still going to have to put receiving, correct?
That's correct.
This is a mess. So, but then they're going to have a separate protocol to deal with the transportation side.
Well, if a seafood receiver in a processing plant or a distribution center were smart, they would figure out how to meet the sanitary transportation requirement in their HACCP plan. And really the receiver, all they have to do is ask every now and then, was the temperature maintained? And they're doing that because they're asking for a chart or something.
Right.
So they've kind of met their requirement.
So that was my next question. Aren't they already doing that?
Yes.
They
should be, yes.
But that's regardless of size.
Yeah.
They're doing all size people, or not all size industry, not people. All size industry are doing that now anyway.
Right. I think the concern that I see with that is seafood HACCP, if you violate your critical limit at receipt, you take different steps than if you were to violate temperature control during transportation under this regulation. This regulation says, first of all, there's no requirement that the receiver even check to make sure the temperature was okay. They can, but they don't have to. And one way that they can do that is the truck driver can give them a temperature. They can take a temperature of the product. That's not allowed under seafood HACCP. You have to have a record of the whole transportation thing. So I could see there being differences of opinion on whether the product's safe or unsafe from the receiver who's trying to follow their seafood HACCP plan versus the truck driver that says, but the temperature, it's cold. I delivered it to you and it's 40 degrees. And the receiver is like, but you violated my HACCP plan because you don't have a record that shows what I need to see. So I can see there being some differences of opinion coming down the road with that one.
Two quick, I hope quick questions. The first was on the transport, both of these I guess are on transport. Barges were not mentioned. I mean, Mississippi has lots of barges. I don't know, they're moving food at the moment, but. Well,
no, the law, the Sanitary Transportation Act, was specific to trucks and rail.
So barges are exempt?
Barges are exempt.
Okay. The other question is, if you've sort of emphasized food, but if you were moving, let's say something like mackerel, which has a histamine potential, strictly from the waste side, that you're running it to a fish meal plant, up 5-10 hours away, is that covered or not? If it's going for fish meal from a food safety point of view,
it's covered because this regulation applies to human food and animal food, so it's required.
But if it weren't toxic in any way, could you not have it for a fish moved for fish meal? We're a quality issue, not a safety issue. Then it would be exempt from that.
If temperature control is only for quality, then that's not covered. It's only if it's for safety.
You kind of hinted that there may be some perhaps leading and maybe large organizations that are perhaps distributors, Costco, Walmart, or whoever, that are already doing some of this. Are you tracking that, or is the federal government tracking people that are essentially complying early, even though they're not required? Is there some awareness? And it seems like that would make sense to sort of scale, bring people in step at a time. And
That's a good question, and I don't know if anyone is tracking that, but FDA did try to have a regulation that matched what they felt the industry was already doing. So I'm sure most shippers are telling the truck driver what temperature it needs to be met at. So they're already doing this. This just put it in So the FDA's view is they're really not asking people to do more than what they are already doing. Whether that's correct or not, I don't know. But that was their intent.
Hey, Lisa, thank you. Do you just have a feeling of why they didn't use the HACCP terminology? Why they came up with all these other new words? So they basically describe the similar stuff? Do you just...
Well, you know, sometimes I look at the exemption that the seafood industry received, and NFI was a big part of that. And sometimes I wonder whether it's a good thing or not. We have a HACCP regulation that puts everything that's food safety related into a HACCP framework. Some things don't fit well in HACCP, but our regulation forces it. The preventive controls concept is more flexible. You can do things in HACCP, but if there's things that you need to be doing, like a certain sanitation procedure that doesn't really fit with a critical limit and a CCP and monitoring, that becomes the preventive control. So you don't have to fit HACCP. So there's some flexibility there. Whether it really makes a difference in the end or not, I don't know. I mean, there's certainly things in that regulation that go way beyond seafood HACCP. So good, we don't have to worry about that right now. But it does give a little more flexibility. I mean, if someone wants to force fit everything into a HACCP plan, they can do that. But I think people would be better off if they handled some, like sanitation controls and things like that, that aren't conducive to critical limits and CCPs. Right. Yeah.
So it's the prerequisite programs that people have.
Yeah. Yeah. But there are certain hazards that would be nice to be able to control in the seafood industry that we don't, because it's, I mean, we can't put it into HACCP, like listeria control or Staph aureus control, which are sanitation controls. So they don't fit the HACCP framework, so they're kind of floating out there people trying to figure out what they need to be doing. Yes.
Can you please expand and clarify the implications of 21 CFR 117B, the GMP side, from the standpoint of fishery using byproducts that are going to be sent over for feed meal or for any kind of animal feed? What are the specific requirements for the food company to handle the byproduct that then is going to be sent for animal feed?
So for production in the United States?
Yes.
There's a couple things you need to do. You have to make sure that you have to take steps to make sure you're not contaminating it as you're staging it. So you have to take steps in that area. You have to label it so people know that it's byproducts that are going to animal feed, and you have to identify what it is. And then the transportation, you have to make sure it's not getting contaminated during transportation. So that's it. If you're not doing anything with it, other than taking it from my processing facility and I'm sending it over to the fish meal plant.
No temperature control?
I have another comment.
Uh-huh.
If there is a potential food safety hazard, the company that is selling or sending the byproducts to the animal feed company has to receive a letter from the animal company saying in the way in which they're going to control that hazard. Because there could be a hazard, a food safety hazard associated with that byproduct. And if that byproduct or hazard is not controlled by the other company and there is a problem, then the recall or the issue can come all the way down to the fishery or to the fish producing company. So my understanding of this is that the company that is sending these byproducts also needs to have a letter from the company using the food for animal feed that describes how the hazard is going to be controlled.
So who's controlling the hazard?
Yes. So
Who's controlling the hazard?
the hazard is being controlled by the feed mill or the company that is producing the animal food. But I am as a food company for human food, I need to know that they're controlling the hazard with my
That may be correct. I think that's one area on the human side that's still kind of up in the air. On the animal side, I'm not that familiar with that supply chain area.
I mean, from knowing that
Yeah.
right, that is one of the requirements that all food facilities
Uh-huh.
that are sending byproducts for animal feed, that they need to do. They have to handle the byproducts under GMPs, like you said, and then they, if there is a hazard associated with it, then the animal facility producing the animal food has to tell the food facility how they're controlling the hazard in case there is a problem later on. So that is the biggest requirement that I see
Uh-huh.
that all byproduct companies or products or food companies that are producing byproducts need to be aware of, because that is the other requirement that they also need to have.
Okay. Thank you.
I can shed some light on that.
Uh-huh.
We have an operation where we have like a livestock production facility, and at the base end we have a animal feed production component. When we get raw materials in to feed the livestock, we have to have traceability and a tag on every ingredient that comes into the facility. That's for the farm side. And that's not FSMA doesn't have any application over that. It's just through our basically our HACCP systems and our critical control points. When we get into the processing, we have to have a clean line of demarcation between the farm side, the production side, and we have to have a validated kill step prior to any FSMA compliance. And our kill step is going through a temperature control system that knocks down all the microbial activity. That kill step has to be validated by a third-party laboratory to ensure we don't have any residual Enterobacter, Salmonella, whatever. Once that kill step is documented, and we're covered by GMPs. Now, on top of that, we have to have sanitization GMPs in place and product separation on the clean side going out. So the hardest part for this was, these are things, basic common sense. I always told the guys that, look, wash your hands, get on the floor, take out the trash. These are real basic things. But the hardest part for this, with compliance, was the record keeping and the traceability all the way back to our supply chain. And a lot of this, it comes into limitation of liability of who is responsible in the case there's an event. It could happen outside of us. So to say, if we sell it to somebody else and there's a problem, we have to have a clean record, say, no, it wasn't us. And I think my interpretation, a lot of the stuff with FSMA gets into finger pointing exercise of who screwed up.
Yeah.
So we're all keeping our Pearl Harbor files to make sure it wasn't us.
Yeah. So there are, I mean, that's certainly some of the fallout of all these regulations, that existing practices, now trying to fit a regulation in with what people have been doing. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Can you confirm that the transporting live seafood is exempt?
Transporting live animals other than mollusk and shellfish is not covered by that regulation.
And is that intuitive, or does that stated in the
It's
regulation?
stated in the regulation.
Thank you.
There are a couple areas where FDA will issue waivers from those sanitary transportation requirements. They haven't issued those waivers yet. They needed to get the regulation out due to a court order. So the pasteurized milk ordinance products, there'll be a waiver for that. There'll be a waiver for retail, because there's requirements under the food code. In our comments and other people's comments, we did ask for a waiver for mollusk and shellfish products that are covered under the ISSC. They're still considering that. So stay tuned for these waivers.
Great. Well, it looks like a lot of people have questions on this. If we had questions.